Hi guys, tonight we'll open the first pages of a strange and quiet story from World War II. When we think about that war, we imagine tanks, planes, and battles. But in the shadows, something unusual was happening. Hidden workshops, secret labs, and desperate minds were creating technologies that looked more like science fiction than real history. Some of these inventions were forgotten, others shaped the modern world in ways we hardly notice today. And this is where our calm journey begins. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. During the years of the Second World War, nations poured enormous resources not only into weapons, but into experiments that tested the limits of human imagination. Many of these projects were born from necessity. When survival is at stake, even the strangest ideas suddenly seem worth exploring. Engineers and scientists were asked to design devices that could change the balance of power, even if they sounded impractical. That meant new materials, unusual vehicles, and experimental devices that today might seem almost unbelievable. Germany, Britain, the United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union all became involved in this race of invention. Each side wanted to outsmart the other, not just with numbers, but with ideas. This was not always about giant tanks or fast airplanes. Sometimes the weirdest projects were small, almost invisible, yet carried the hope of turning the tide of war. One example came from Germany's obsession with building miracle weapons. The German leadership believed that secret technology could give them an advantage when conventional forces began to fail. Among these projects was a plan to develop aircraft that could travel faster and higher than anything before. Engineers were told to think beyond the limits of what was possible. The result was a series of prototypes that looked more like rockets than airplanes. The Messerschmitt Me 262, for instance, was the first operational jet fighter in the world. It flew faster than Allied planes, creating fear that it could dominate the skies. But alongside this very real machine were designs that were stranger still. Paper sketches showed flying discs, vertical takeoff aircraft, and bombers that could cross the Atlantic without refueling. These ideas sounded like dreams, yet the desperation of war pushed them onto drawing boards. In Britain, inventors were also working on unusual projects. One such project involved a weapon made not of steel, but of frozen water. Scientists explored the possibility of building massive aircraft carriers from pykrete, a mixture of ice and wood pulp. The idea was that such ships would be cheap, resistant to torpedoes, and could be built in Arctic waters. Imagine an aircraft carrier the size of a small island, floating quietly on the sea, made largely of frozen material. It never came into full production, but the experiments were serious enough that blocks of pykrete were tested in laboratories, and senior leaders even considered deploying them. Across the Atlantic in the United States, the search for new technology also produced ideas that were both practical and bizarre. One of the most unusual was the development of bat bombs. The plan was simple in concept, yet wild in execution. Release thousands of bats carrying tiny incendiary charges over Japanese cities. The bats, seeking shelter in wooden houses and attics, would then ignite countless fires simultaneously. Tests were conducted with real bats, and the project advanced surprisingly far before it was eventually cancelled. Though it never reached combat, it shows how far wartime imagination could stretch. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, scientists faced shortages of resources and looked for unconventional solutions. Some projects focused on simple but strange tools: silent submachine guns with unusual suppressors, armoured sleds pulled by horses, and experimental snow vehicles designed for icy landscapes. Each invention reflected the particular struggles of the Eastern Front, where conditions were harsh and every advantage mattered. Japan, too, pursued unique technologies. Among their most unusual were balloon bombs. These were large paper balloons carrying explosives designed to float across the Pacific Ocean and land in the United States. Launched into the jet stream, they could travel thousands of miles. Some of these balloons did reach American soil, causing small fires and even a few tragic casualties. For the first time, a weapon created on one continent travelled silently to strike another. It was a chilling preview of long-range warfare. All of these examples remind us that war is not only about strength, but also about imagination. The pressure of survival forced nations to dream in strange directions. Some of these inventions look laughable today, others unsettling, but all of them tell us something about human creativity under stress. As we begin this journey, remember, what may seem like fantasy now was once considered a possible path to victory. As the war deepened, the search for unusual technology grew more urgent. The world's greatest powers realized that traditional methods were not enough. Armies had already reached the limits of what could be achieved with rifles, tanks, and artillery. To gain an edge, they needed to experiment, even if it meant stepping into strange and untested territory. Germany in particular became fascinated with new types of aircraft. Beyond the famous jet fighter, their engineers worked on experimental bombers that seemed to belong more to science fiction than the battlefield. One of these was the Horten Ho 229, a jet-powered flying wing. Its sleek, triangular shape was unlike anything else in the skies. With its wooden frame covered by smooth surfaces, it looked futuristic, and its design even reduced radar detection. Decades later, historians would point out how much it resembled stealth aircraft developed in the late 20th century. At the time, however, it was fragile, underfunded, and produced too late to change the outcome of the war. Still, the fact that it existed at all showed how bold engineers had become. Britain responded in its own creative ways. While radar is now considered a standard part of modern defence, back in the early 1940s it was still mysterious and new. British scientists perfected radar systems that could detect incoming enemy planes long before they reached their targets. To protect these systems, decoys and camouflage were used to mislead enemy bombers. Entire fake airfields were built, complete with wooden aircraft and glowing lights, to trick the Germans into wasting their bombs on empty ground. This mixture of science and deception became a strange kind of technology in itself. On the American side, another unusual project emerged, the proximity fuse. Instead of relying on a direct hit, these small devices allowed anti-aircraft shells to explode automatically when they came close to a target. The concept required tiny, rugged radio transmitters inside each shell, something that had never been attempted before. Developing them was a technical nightmare, but once completed, they transformed the defence against enemy aircraft. Japanese pilots found it far harder to dive against ships protected by this invisible shield. What once seemed impossible became a hidden advantage. Japan, facing increasing shortages of materials, turned to unconventional weapons as well. One of the strangest was their attempt to create human-guided torpedoes, known as kaiten. These were essentially small submarines steered directly by a pilot who did not expect to return. Though tragic and desperate, the idea represented another form of unusual wartime technology. Machines designed less for efficiency than for psychological and symbolic impact. In the Soviet Union, engineers worked under constant pressure, often with very little to work with. Their solutions were sometimes crude but imaginative. One example was the use of dog mines, where animals were trained to carry explosives under enemy tanks. It was an unsettling project that showed how far desperation could push wartime innovation. While controversial and not very effective, it reflects the same pattern seen across all nations. When survival was at stake, even the strangest paths were tried. What stands out from this period is not only the range of technologies, but the atmosphere in which they were created. War blurred the line between what was reasonable and what was fantastic. Laboratories and workshops became places where normal rules no longer applied. Ideas that might have been dismissed in peacetime were suddenly tested in real battle conditions. For every success like radar or the jet fighter, there were dozens of odd projects that never left the drawing board. Yet each of them leaves behind a quiet story of human creativity under pressure. By the middle of the war, Germany's experimental program grew into something almost mythical. Hidden facilities across the country worked on projects that blended real engineering with daring imagination. One striking example was the V-1 flying bomb, often called the buzz bomb. It was essentially an early cruise missile, powered by a simple pulse jet engine that gave off a loud, uneven roar. The weapon was crude, inaccurate, and often fell short of its targets, yet it terrified civilians in London who heard the strange sound above their rooftops. Soon after came the V-2 rocket, a far more advanced creation. Designed by Wernher von Braun and his team, it was the first long-range ballistic missile in history. Launched from mobile platforms, it flew faster than the speed of sound, striking without warning. For the people living under its path, it felt like something out of another world. While its impact on the war was limited, its influence on future space exploration was enormous. After the war, captured V-2 technology became the foundation for both American and Soviet rocket programs, leading eventually to satellites and human spaceflight. Elsewhere, German engineers dreamed even bigger. They drafted plans for America bombers, long-range aircraft capable of reaching the United States. Some designs imagined jet-powered giants with extended wings and fuel systems that seemed impossible for the time. Most of these aircraft never left the drawing board, but the ambition alone shows the strange directions wartime thinking could take. Across the Channel, Britain sought its own innovations. One curious project was the invention of HUF-DUF, short for high-frequency direction finding. This technology allowed Allied ships to detect and locate German U-boats by picking up their radio transmissions. It worked quietly, with no dramatic explosions or futuristic shapes, yet it saved countless lives by helping convoys cross the Atlantic. For the sailors who depended on supplies, this quiet and unusual technology was as important as any great weapon. Meanwhile, American researchers pressed forward with ideas that seemed outlandish but were tested seriously. One of these was Project Habakkuk, the frozen aircraft carrier idea made from Picrete. Though already mentioned in early discussions, by this stage scientists actually tried to build prototypes. They found that Picrete resisted bullets and took a long time to melt, making it surprisingly durable. In Canada, a large test model was constructed on a lake, and for a time, it seemed the project might advance. Ultimately, the enormous cost and practical difficulties led to its cancellation, but the thought of a giant floating fortress of ice remains one of the strangest visions of wartime engineering. In Japan, experiments were also moving into unusual territory. Engineers tested rocket-powered aircraft and even underwater planes. The Japanese submarine I-400 class was among the largest ever built, designed to carry small aircraft inside watertight hangars. The plan was to launch surprise air raids from the sea, attacking cities and bases far from Japan. Though these submarines arrived too late to change the war, they demonstrated an unusual blend of sea and air technology. Taken together, these efforts remind us of the strange balance between desperation and creativity. Nations under pressure will try anything that offers a chance, no matter how unusual. Some of these technologies worked, some failed, and some lived on quietly, shaping the future in ways no one at the time could have predicted. As the war pushed into its later years, the pressure to invent something transformative reached a fever pitch. Germany continued to pour resources into Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons, each one promising a breakthrough that might turn the tide. Among the strangest were experimental tanks. The Maus, for example, was an enormous machine weighing more than 180 tons. Too heavy to cross most bridges, it was slow and impractical, yet its sheer size symbolized an obsession with extreme solutions. Another design, the Landkreuzer P1000 Ratte, was a proposed mega-tank so large it could have carried naval guns. It never went beyond paper, but the fact that engineers seriously discussed it reveals how desperate and imaginative thinking had become. On the seas, the Germans also experimented with miniature submarines. These small, one- or two-man craft were meant to slip into harbours, plant explosives, or disrupt Allied shipping. Many proved unreliable, but they forced defenders to spread their attention across new and unexpected threats. Britain, for its part, was equally inventive in the realm of deception. One of their most unusual efforts was Operation Fortitude, a vast plan to trick Germany about the location of the D-Day invasion. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and false radio traffic created the illusion of an entire army preparing to strike elsewhere. This was not technology in the sense of engines and weapons, but a carefully crafted use of materials and imagination. Inflatable rubber tanks sitting quietly in fields looked real from the air, and that illusion helped shape the course of the war. In the United States, unusual projects often lean toward new aviation concepts. The military explored flying bombs, guided missiles, and even remote-controlled aircraft. One project involved converting old bombers into drones packed with explosives, guided by radio signals or sometimes by pilots who would bail out at the last moment. These ideas pushed the boundaries of what technology meant, stretching from engineering into the beginnings of automation. At the same time, American researchers developed new materials. Nylon, for example, was used for parachutes, replacing silk that had become difficult to obtain. Synthetic rubber was also created to solve shortages, leading to an industry that still shapes modern products. In the Soviet Union, strange battlefield devices appeared. Engineers produced armoured trains equipped not only with guns but with anti-aircraft defences, turning long stretches of track into mobile fortresses. These trains were intimidating, noisy, and unusual, yet they served a practical role in transporting supplies and defending against surprise attacks. Japan added to this list with weapons that blended psychology with engineering. Their Oka, or cherry blossom, was a rocket-powered glider packed with explosives, piloted on one-way missions. It was strange in its simplicity, little more than a flying warhead with wings, but it showed how innovation sometimes turned toward desperation rather than refinement. Looking across these projects, one notices a common thread. Whether giant tanks, ice carriers, or miniature submarines, the ideas reveal a moment when imagination was stretched to its limits. Many of these technologies were impractical, some tragic, and a few successful, but each one reflected the strange atmosphere of a world at war. By 1943, technology in the war began to look less like traditional warfare and more like glimpses of the future. Germany's rockets drew headlines, but their experiments with jet aircraft also deserve attention. The Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet was one of the strangest creations to ever fly. A small, rocket-powered interceptor, it could climb at breathtaking speed, leaving Allied pilots stunned. Yet its design carried serious risks. The fuel was dangerously unstable, and many German pilots died in training accidents before even facing the enemy. Despite its problems, the Comet showed how wartime pressure could produce radical advances in flight. Britain, meanwhile, was using science to protect its cities. Beyond radar, they developed acoustic detection systems, large concrete sound mirrors built along the coast before the war. These massive curved walls could pick up the distant hum of approaching aircraft engines, giving precious minutes of warning. Although radar soon replaced them, the idea of using sound as an early warning technology was both unusual and ingenious. Across the Atlantic, the United States was pouring energy into electronic warfare. One curious invention was the carpet jammer, designed to confuse enemy radar by broadcasting disruptive signals. Another was chaff, thin strips of aluminum dropped from aircraft to create false echoes on radar screens. Entire bomber formations survived because enemy guns and radar operators could not tell real planes from shimmering clouds of foil drifting through the night sky. In the Pacific, Japan explored weapons that reached beyond the battlefield. Their balloon bombs were released in large numbers, floating high into the jet stream and carried silently toward North America. Though most never caused damage, a few landed and exploded, proving that even across oceans, war could find its way into civilian lives. For many Americans at the time, the idea of bombs drifting in from the sky with no warning felt unsettling, even surreal. On the Soviet front, innovation often meant adapting simple tools to extreme environments. Snowmobiles powered by aircraft engines, armoured sleds, and even skis for paratroopers were tested. These ideas sound unusual, but they reflected the practical reality of fighting in frozen landscapes where traditional vehicles could not move. Such machines rarely reached mass production, yet they capture the strange creativity born in desperate winters. Together, these inventions, some successful, some forgotten, paint a picture of war as a laboratory of strange ideas. Each nation, facing its own challenges, reached for unusual solutions, creating a mixture of brilliance, risk, and imagination that continues to fascinate today. In the hidden corners of laboratories, another type of unusual technology was taking shape. Projects that blurred the line between science and imagination. One such field was chemical experimentation. Both the Allies and Axis powers searched for substances that could either protect their soldiers or harm the enemy in new ways. Germany developed synthetic fuels and lubricants to keep tanks and aircraft running despite shortages. The Allies in turn invested heavily in synthetic rubber, as natural supplies had been cut off by Japanese control in Asia. This was not a weapon in the traditional sense, but without it, vehicles, aircraft, and even boots for soldiers would have been impossible to produce at scale. From these wartime struggles came an entire post-war industry that changed everyday life. Another strange idea revolved around camouflage. Beyond ordinary paint and netting, militaries experimented with dazzle patterns designed to confuse the human eye. Ships were painted with bold, jagged lines in black, white, and grey, making it difficult for submarine crews to judge their speed and distance. Some airfields were disguised as peaceful villages, complete with fake houses and streets, to hide aircraft hangars from enemy reconnaissance. The line between battlefield and stagecraft blurred as engineers and artists worked side by side to create illusions. In America, one of the strangest research paths was animal-based technology. We already know about bat bombs, but there was also serious thought given to using pigeons as living guidance systems. Psychologist B.F. Skinner trained pigeons to peck at images of targets. The birds were placed inside a clear nose cone of a missile, and as they pecked at the target image, their movements adjusted the flight controls. Tests showed the pigeons could guide bombs with surprising accuracy. The project was eventually abandoned in favour of electronic systems, but it stands as one of the oddest blends of biology and machinery in wartime. In the Soviet Union, scientists explored protective technologies against the brutal cold. Heated clothing, experimental insulation materials, and compact stoves designed for frontline soldiers were developed. While less spectacular than rockets or jets, these inventions were vital to survival in frozen trenches and forests. They reflected a different kind of ingenuity, quiet, practical, and shaped by harsh conditions. Japan also worked on peculiar submarine innovations. Some were designed to launch aircraft, while others carried midget subs for sneak attacks on harbours. These combinations of sea and air power were unusual, pushing the limits of traditional naval design. Though few achieved lasting success, they show how Japan, like other nations, sought solutions in directions that seemed unconventional. What ties all these projects together is not whether they succeeded, but the way they reveal human creativity under pressure. War forced scientists and engineers to think in ways they never would have imagined in peacetime. Some of their creations faded into obscurity. Others became stepping stones for technologies we now take for granted. In every case, the weirdness of these inventions tells us something deeper about the lengths people will go when survival and victory are at stake. As the conflict stretched on, the drive for unusual solutions led deeper into the skies. The race for advanced aviation became a showcase of both genius and desperation. German engineers pursued jet and rocket aircraft, but another unusual concept was the idea of vertical takeoff planes. Designs like the Triebflügel never left the drawing board, but the concept was striking. A tail-sitting interceptor with rotating wings powered by jet engines. It looked more like something from science fiction than from a 1940s airfield. Although never built, such sketches foreshadowed the experiments that decades later would lead to real vertical lift aircraft. Across the Channel, the British continued to push radar technology into stranger directions. One development was G, a navigation system that allowed bombers to find their way even at night or through clouds. Using radio signals from ground stations, crews could pinpoint their location with remarkable accuracy. For civilians on the ground, this was invisible, but for airmen flying in darkness, it was nothing short of revolutionary. In America, another bold project appeared: the development of early guided bombs. Known as AZON, these weapons could be steered left or right by radio control, giving bombardiers a way to hit bridges or narrow targets that had once been nearly impossible to destroy from the air. Though primitive by today's standards, these guided bombs marked the birth of precision strike technology. Meanwhile, in Japan, the search for air advantage took on unusual forms. Beyond kamikaze aircraft, engineers experimented with rocket-assisted gliders designed to close in on ships at terrifying speed. Some of these were manned, others were prototypes meant to be launched from submarines. Though few reached actual use, they illustrate the extent to which engineers were trying to stretch the limits of what flying machines could do. The Soviet Union, facing immense challenges, applied its creativity in more practical ways. One unusual invention was the night bomber tactics of the 588th Regiment, later nicknamed the Night Witches. Their aircraft were simple wooden biplanes, nearly obsolete, yet they used them to strike German positions silently at low altitudes. The plane's engines were cut before the attack, and the gliding approach created an eerie whisper that terrified enemy soldiers. It was not advanced machinery, but the use of technology in such a strange psychological way makes it one of the more memorable oddities of the war. Taken together, these aerial experiments reveal a fascinating truth. Even when designs failed or remained prototypes, they shaped ideas of what might be possible. The skies of World War II were not only battlefields but also laboratories of invention, where strange shapes and sounds hinted at the technology of tomorrow. The seas of World War II became just as much a playground for unusual inventions as the skies. Germany, relying heavily on its submarine fleet, introduced new designs that stretched the imagination. The Type 21 U-boat was a leap forward, with batteries large enough to stay submerged for long periods, and a streamlined hull that made it faster underwater than on the surface. Though it arrived too late to change the war, its design shaped the submarines of the Cold War era. Alongside these advances, Germany tested tiny one-man subs like the Biber, meant for quick strikes in coastal waters. Fragile and cramped, they were difficult to use but reflected how far innovation could be pushed in desperate times. Britain, aware of the submarine threat, came up with unusual counters. One of the most curious was the Hedgehog, a forward-firing anti-submarine weapon. Unlike depth charges that exploded after sinking, the Hedgehog launched a pattern of small bombs that only detonated on contact. This gave escorts a better chance of striking hidden submarines. It was a modest-looking device, but it changed the rhythm of naval warfare. Another strange British project was the use of Q-ships, ordinary-looking merchant vessels secretly armed with heavy guns. They lured submarines into attacking, only to reveal their hidden weapons at the last moment. It was a technological trick disguised as trade. In the United States, unusual naval projects also surfaced. One involved massive blimps that patrolled coastlines and escorted convoys. These lighter-than-air craft were slow and almost old-fashioned, yet they could spot submarines from above and cover vast stretches of ocean. Their quiet presence added an unexpected layer of defence. Japan contributed its own oddities, including the I-400 class submarines, among the largest ever built, designed to carry aircraft in watertight hangars. The plan was to launch surprise raids far from home, blending sea and air power in a way no other nation attempted. Though they saw little use before the war ended, they were remarkable feats of engineering. The Soviets, meanwhile, experimented with armoured riverboats. Small but heavily armed, these floating platforms fought not on oceans but along rivers, supporting infantry with artillery and machine guns. In their own way, they represented a strange adaptation of naval technology to the unique geography of the Eastern Front. All these unusual machines remind us that the ocean was more than a backdrop. It was a vast arena where invention took unusual forms. from giant subs to fragile miniatures, from hidden weapons to airborne patrols. The seas of World War II reflected the same restless creativity that marked every part of the conflict. On the ground, the war produced some of the most unusual machines of all. Germany, obsessed with size and power, experimented with colossal artillery. The Schwerer Gustav was the largest gun ever built, weighing over 1,300 tons and requiring a dedicated railway track to move. Its shells were as heavy as a small car and could smash through fortifications miles away. Despite its power, the gun was slow to set up and easy to target, showing how impractical some wonder weapons truly were. Alongside this came the Nebelwerfer, a rocket launcher that fired salvos with a terrifying scream. It was effective but also psychological, filling battlefields with an unsettling sound that lingered in soldiers' memories. The Soviets, facing relentless assaults, relied on different kinds of unusual ground weapons. Their Katyusha rocket launchers became iconic. Mounted on trucks, they could unleash a storm of rockets in seconds. The sight and sound were overwhelming, earning them the nickname Stalin's organ. Although simple, they embodied the strange balance of terror and practicality that many wartime technologies shared. Britain pursued armoured vehicles in creative directions. Beyond traditional tanks, engineers developed the Churchill Crocodile, a flame-throwing tank that projected streams of fire to clear bunkers and trenches. To those who saw it in action, it was one of the strangest and most fearsome machines on the battlefield. Another oddity was the Crab, a tank fitted with rotating flails to detonate mines. Its unusual appearance made it look almost comical, yet it saved countless lives during assaults by clearing safe paths through dangerous terrain. In the United States, engineers also pushed the limits of ground warfare. One strange project was the Weasel, a small tracked vehicle designed to move supplies and soldiers across snow and swamps. Light, agile, and almost toy-like, it proved unexpectedly useful in harsh conditions. Another experimental design was the T-10 Mine Exploder, a massive vehicle equipped with huge rollers intended to set off mines by sheer weight. Though not widely used, it demonstrates how unusual shapes and functions emerged under battlefield pressures. Japan, too, ventured into strange designs. They developed miniature tanks for jungle warfare, though these often proved underpowered. In some cases, they even turned to manned suicide weapons on land, echoing the same desperation seen in the skies and seas. These strange ground inventions highlight the diversity of wartime imagination. Some were massive and loud, others small and practical, but all reflected the same drive to create something new, however odd, to meet the unique challenges of the battlefield. Beyond weapons, the war pushed medicine and biology into strange territory. On the Allied side, one of the most important yet unusual advances was the mass production of penicillin. Before the war, this antibiotic existed only in small laboratory samples. Wartime urgency forced scientists to find ways to grow it in huge quantities, using vats, moulds, and creative farming of bacteria. By D-Day, penicillin was being shipped in bulk to the front, saving thousands of soldiers from infections that once proved deadly. It was a quiet revolution, born in war but destined to change everyday medicine forever. Another curious advance was the invention of blood plasma preservation. Doctors needed to treat wounded soldiers far from hospitals, so researchers developed methods to separate plasma from whole blood and store it safely for transport. This technology was unusual at the time, but it allowed medics to stabilize patients until they could reach proper care. After the war, the same idea spread into civilian hospitals, shaping modern emergency medicine. In Germany, medical research often followed darker paths. Some scientists experimented with hypothermia, high-altitude survival, and even pressure chambers, trying to understand how much the human body could endure. While much of this work was unethical and cruel, it still represents how the search for knowledge during the war often crossed into unsettling territory. Not all strange medical technology was sinister, however. In the United States, researchers created the first large-scale insect control programs, spraying DDT to combat malaria in military zones. Though later found to be harmful to the environment, at the time it was viewed as a miracle, drastically reducing disease among troops in the Pacific. The Soviets, dealing with vast and harsh conditions, pioneered field hospitals on railways. Entire medical trains equipped with surgery rooms and wards travelled close behind the front, picking up the wounded and treating them while on the move. This blending of transportation and medicine was unusual but effective, ensuring care reached soldiers faster than ever before. Japan too explored biological paths. One of the strangest was their attempt to use insects as weapons, releasing plague-carrying fleas in certain regions. Though deeply disturbing, it shows how war blurred the line between natural science and technology. Taken together, these medical advances, some life-saving, others unsettling, remind us that technology in wartime was not only about machines and weapons. The battlefield extended into the human body, forcing innovation in health, survival, and sometimes in ways that reshape the future of medicine itself. When we step back from the front lines and look into the factories and workshops, we find another layer of strange wartime technology, materials and industrial processes that seemed small at the time but reshaped the modern world. One example was plastics. Before the war, plastics were limited and rarely used, but shortages of metals, silk and rubber pushed scientists to invent substitutes. Nylon replaced silk in parachutes and ropes. Perspex, a clear plastic, became vital for aircraft canopies and gun turrets, lighter and tougher than glass. These innovations didn't always make headlines, yet they represented a quiet revolution in everyday materials. Another unusual development was in food technology. Feeding millions of soldiers across continents required more than canned meat. The United States created powdered eggs, instant coffee, and vitamin-enriched rations. Britain developed concentrated emergency chocolate, designed to be both calorie-dense and resistant to heat. These foods may sound unremarkable now, but at the time they were unusual inventions that balanced science with survival. After the war, many of them made their way into kitchens and supermarkets, shaping modern convenience food. Germany, meanwhile, invested in synthetic fuels and oils. Cut off from major supplies, German scientists developed methods to turn coal into liquid fuel. Though expensive and inefficient, these processes kept tanks and aircraft moving long after natural supplies dwindled. Decades later, some of these techniques resurfaced in civilian energy research. In the Soviet Union, the challenge was different. With vast territory and brutal winters, their industry created portable stoves, insulated clothing, and lightweight prefabricated huts for troops. These may not sound like technology in the traditional sense, but they represented unusual creative responses to conditions no other front experienced in quite the same way. Japan too faced scarcity and came up with strange alternatives. They experimented with wooden aircraft, using laminated wood when aluminum became scarce. Some planes were remarkably durable, showing that even limited resources could spark unusual innovation. On the sea, they coated submarine periscopes with special anti-reflective paint to reduce detection. Small adjustments like these reveal how even the tiniest details of technology mattered. Across all nations, war became a laboratory for material science. From plastics to powdered food, from synthetic fuel to insulated huts. These unusual inventions weren't always glamorous, but they reshaped the world in quiet ways. It is strange to think that products we take for granted today, nylon stockings, instant coffee, even frozen meals, owe their existence to the urgent creativity of wartime. When people think of war, they imagine guns and bombs, yet some of the strangest inventions were designed not to destroy but to confuse. Deception became its own branch of technology. In Britain, the creation of entire ghost armies became one of the most unusual projects of all. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and fake radio signals gave the illusion of divisions that did not exist. Fields were filled with rubber vehicles that looked real from the sky. tricking enemy reconnaissance planes. At night, soldiers lit fake campfires or drove trucks in circles to imitate the movement of a large army. These illusions were not toys. They were strategic tools that misdirected enemy forces and saved real lives. In the United States, deception also grew into an art. The so-called Ghost Army, a special unit of artists, sound engineers and designers, was tasked with creating illusions across Europe. They used loudspeakers to broadcast the sound of moving tanks, even though no tanks were there. Inflatable vehicles lined roads, and fake uniforms and patches added to the illusion. It was technology mixed with theatre, and though strange, it played a real role in operations across France and Germany. Germany itself was no stranger to deception. Camouflage scientists experimented with patterns inspired by nature, leading to early designs of what we now call camouflage uniforms. They also created dummy airfields filled with wooden planes, hoping to draw Allied bombers away from real targets. Though these fakes often fooled no one for long, they illustrate how creativity extended beyond engineering into visual trickery. Japan explored deception differently. They relied on decoys and concealed positions in jungle terrain, blending artillery into landscapes with such care that it sometimes went unnoticed until too late. In the Pacific, American troops often found themselves fighting enemies who seemed to vanish, supported by technology of concealment as much as by weaponry. The Soviets, fighting in forests and cities, turned entire towns into illusions. Buildings were painted with false shadows, rooftops disguised with netting, and factories hidden beneath elaborate covers. The goal was to protect production from air raids by making the enemy see something that wasn't there. This merging of art, science, and survival created results that were at once practical and surreal. These deceptive technologies remind us that not every invention was about raw firepower. Sometimes the strangest tools were the ones that created doubt and hesitation in the enemy's mind. Inflatable tanks, fake sounds, painted towns, all of them belong to the unusual arsenal of World War II, proving that imagination could be as powerful as steel. Among the strangest wartime technologies were those that tried to control the invisible forces of nature, light, sound, and even the weather. Britain experimented with devices called starfish sights, which were elaborate decoy systems built to mislead German bombers at night. When cities were attacked, these sights were set ablaze in carefully controlled patterns, creating the illusion of urban areas under bombardment. Pilots, seeing the glow from above, often released their bombs on empty fields instead of real neighbourhoods. It was a remarkable blend of fire, engineering and psychology, saving countless civilians from destruction. Germany explored unusual paths as well. One curious project was the use of infrared technology for night fighting. Engineers developed rifle scopes and tank sights that used infrared lamps, invisible to the naked eye but visible through special sensors. These night vision devices were primitive compared to modern standards, but for soldiers who used them, they were glimpses of a future battlefield where darkness no longer offered safety. Across the ocean, American researchers created equally unusual devices. The proximity fuse, already a major breakthrough, was joined by experiments in guided weapons that relied on television cameras. Tiny cameras placed inside bombs transmitted images back to operators who attempted to steer them in real time. The technology was unreliable and often failed, yet the idea itself was decades ahead of its time. In the Pacific, Japan pursued weather-based warfare. They launched balloon bombs using the jet stream, but they also studied how to create artificial fog to conceal troop movements. Though these projects never reached large-scale deployment, the fact that they were considered shows the unusual range of wartime creativity. The Soviets also worked with sound in unexpected ways. Engineers built massive loudspeaker systems to blast propaganda or strange noises across enemy lines, hoping to confuse or demoralize opposing troops. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense, but it was a psychological technology that played with perception. Another peculiar Soviet project involved experimenting with portable floodlights mounted on tanks. These bright beams were designed to blind enemy defenders during nighttime assaults. In practice, the lights revealed positions as much as they hid them, yet the concept itself demonstrates how unusual ideas could seem worth trying under pressure. Taken together, these projects remind us that the war was not only fought with steel and fire, it was also fought with illusions, invisible rays, and experiments that touched forces people barely understood. Some of these technologies faded, others became the seeds of modern innovations, but all belong to the strange creative world that war had forced into existence. One of the strangest aspects of wartime innovation was the blending of animals with machines. While it sounds like the stuff of legend, several serious projects explored this path. The United States tested Project Pigeon, in which trained birds guided bombs by pecking at images of targets. Although electronic systems eventually replaced it, the fact that living creatures were considered part of precision weaponry is a striking reminder of wartime imagination. Another American idea, though quickly abandoned, was the use of bats to carry tiny incendiary charges. Thousands were released during experiments, with the hope that they would roost in Japanese buildings and ignite fires. While it never reached the battlefield, the concept showed how desperation could push science towards strange directions. Germany also studied ways to incorporate animals into technology. One experiment involved using dogs to deliver explosives against tanks. The project proved unreliable and controversial, but it was nonetheless pursued as a possible solution during difficult years. Horses, too, played a role even in this age of tanks. German and Soviet forces relied on millions of horses for transport across harsh terrain, and engineers created specialized saddles, carts, and even protective gear to keep them effective on the battlefield. Japan took this idea further with its use of animal carriers. Mules and oxen were fitted with unusual harnesses designed to haul heavy weapons through jungles where vehicles could not pass. Although these devices may not sound high-tech, they represent another unusual form of wartime invention. Tools designed for animals as much as for humans. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, explored animals for communication. Dogs and pigeons carried messages across battlefields when radios failed, and engineers built special harnesses and containers to protect them. These systems were simple but vital, bridging the gap between traditional methods and modern machines. At sea, another strange animal-inspired idea emerged: the use of dolphins for mine detection. Though not fully realized until later decades, the concept began in wartime discussions as navies searched for new ways to clear dangerous waters. Even the suggestion reveals how wide the net of imagination had been cast. Looking at these projects, one cannot help but notice how unusual they appear today. Yet in the chaos of global conflict, no idea seemed too strange to test. Birds, bats, and dogs were pressed into service alongside rockets and submarines. Some of these efforts failed, others saved lives, and a few foreshadowed technologies that would reappear in later years. In their own way, they capture the restless creativity that marked the war, where even the natural world was reshaped into tools for survival. Strange wartime inventions were not always about weapons. Many were about communication, how to send messages secretly, reliably, and across great distances. Britain, fighting a war of survival, turned to code-breaking as one of its most unusual and powerful tools. At Bletchley Park, mathematicians and engineers built the first programmable electronic computers, such as Colossus. These machines were designed to break German ciphers, processing streams of encrypted text faster than any human team could. They looked nothing like modern laptops, with their rows of glowing valves and endless cables, but they were revolutionary. This unusual blend of war and mathematics quietly opened the door to the digital age. Germany also pursued unusual communication technology. One strange creation was the Enigma machine itself, a typewriter-like device that scrambled messages into complex codes. At the time, it was considered unbreakable. The confidence in this machine was so great that entire military strategies depended on it. The irony is that the same device that gave Germany an early edge also inspired the Allied technologies that helped turn the war against them. In the United States, radio became the heart of innovation. Portable field radios shrank in size, with backpack versions allowing infantry to stay connected in ways never possible before. Engineers also explored scrambling systems, creating voice inversion devices that distorted speech so only receivers with the right equipment could understand it. To civilian ears, it sounded like nonsense, but for the military it was a new level of secrecy. Japan, facing shortages and isolation, also turned to creative communication. They developed underwater telephones for submarines, allowing vessels to talk to each other silently beneath the waves. Though often unreliable, it was a curious attempt to make the ocean itself a medium for speech. The Soviets, meanwhile, relied on a mixture of old and new. Alongside radios, they used telegraph lines hidden in forests, and even trained signal troops to lay cables at incredible speed during battle. One unusual Soviet invention was the R-105, an early attempt at a rugged field radio designed to survive harsh winters and rough handling. These tools may not have seemed glamorous, but they were essential for coordinating massive movements across the Eastern Front. What makes these communication technologies unusual is not just their design, but the fact that they bridge the gap between the old world and the new. From code machines and giant computers to tiny radios and secret telephones, the war forced humans to reimagine how information could travel. In that sense, the battlefield was not only about bullets and bombs, it was also about words, numbers, and the strange machines that carried them. Among the more unusual technologies of the war were those designed to change how soldiers moved across landscapes. Mobility was not just about tanks or trucks. It was about adapting to terrain that often resisted machines. In Germany, engineers worked on the Kettenkrad, a strange hybrid between a motorcycle and a small tracked vehicle. With handlebars in front and caterpillar tracks behind, it looked unconventional but was remarkably useful. It could pull artillery, carry supplies, or drive through mud and snow where ordinary vehicles stalled. Though small in size, it left a lasting impression as one of the strangest yet practical machines of the war. Britain also experimented with unusual mobility solutions. The Bren gun carrier, often nicknamed the Universal Carrier, was a small, open-topped tracked vehicle. It was not a tank nor a truck, but something in between, capable of carrying weapons, troops, or supplies. Its versatility made it a quiet success story, though its appearance puzzled many at first glance. Even more unusual were amphibious vehicles. Britain and America both tested designs that could drive on land and float on water. The American WWII, nicknamed the Duck, became one of the most effective. With wheels for roads and a hull for rivers, it carried supplies directly from ships to shore during invasions. To see trucks rolling down a beach and then calmly floating into the surf was a strange sight, but one that proved invaluable. The Soviets also adapted mobility to their vast landscapes. They built sleds pulled by aircraft engines, turning snowy plains into highways of ice. These aerosani, as they were called, looked almost like small flying machines without wings, buzzing across frozen rivers to deliver troops and supplies. Though limited in combat use, they captured the unusual creativity required to fight in Russia's winters. Japan, dealing with jungles and islands, experimented with miniaturized transport. One odd design was a motorized cart that folded for easy carrying, intended to help soldiers move equipment through dense terrain. They also tested amphibious tanks capable of swimming between islands, blending naval and land technology in unusual ways. Looking across these inventions, one theme becomes clear. Strange vehicles were born not from imagination alone, but from necessity. Each unusual machine answered a specific problem: snow too deep for wheels, rivers blocking supply lines, jungles too thick for trucks. Some of these technologies disappeared after the war, while others inspired future designs. Together they remind us that even mobility itself became a field of experimentation, full of curious shapes and surprising ideas. Wartime invention often pushed the boundaries of what counted as a weapon. some of the most unusual technologies blurred the line between science, psychology, and spectacle. One example was the search for sound-based weapons. Germany experimented with what they called the sound cannon, a device intended to use focused acoustic energy to damage or disorient enemy troops. Large parabolic dishes concentrated sound waves, producing vibrations strong enough to rattle nerves or even, in theory, stop a heart at close range. The idea was fascinating but ultimately impractical, as it required enormous power and precise conditions to work. Still, it reflected the willingness to test ideas that bordered on science fiction. Britain, on the other hand, turned to sound for deception rather than destruction. The Ghost Army and other units developed recordings of tanks, trucks, and construction, blasting them through giant loudspeakers to simulate whole armies on the move. For soldiers in the field, hearing the rumble of an approaching force that did not exist could be as unnerving as facing a real one. This unusual form of acoustic camouflage shows how sound became another battlefield tool. The Americans also explored psychological technology in different ways. Leaflet bombs were created to scatter propaganda from the sky, delivering not explosives but messages. Though simple in design, these devices were a strange reminder that words themselves could become weapons. Alongside this, experiments with light produced other oddities. One British invention was the Canal Defence Light, a powerful searchlight mounted inside a tank. Its beam could be split and rapidly moved, creating a flickering effect meant to blind and confuse enemy defenders during night assaults. Though rarely used, its mere existence highlights the strange ways light itself became a weapon. The Soviets also worked on psychological tools. In some battles, they fitted tanks with loudspeakers to blast patriotic music or threatening messages across enemy lines. It may not sound like technology in the traditional sense, but it required creativity, engineering, and the recognition that morale could be as important as firepower. Japan, too, explored psychological inventions. Balloon bombs were not just physical weapons. They were intended to spread fear by making Americans realize that the war could reach their homeland in silent, unexpected ways. In that sense, even a fragile paper balloon became part of psychological warfare. Looking across these examples, we see that the war was not only about bullets and steel, but also about perception. Sound, light, and words were twisted into technologies designed to unsettle, confuse, or frighten. They may seem unusual, even surreal, yet they reflect the truth that victory in war often depends as much on the mind as on the battlefield. Among the most unusual wartime technologies were those meant to bridge the gap between land and sea. Amphibious innovation became essential as invasions and island campaigns shaped the conflict. In the United States, one of the strangest yet most successful vehicles was the Landing Vehicle Tracked, or LVT. Originally designed as a civilian rescue craft for swamps, it was adapted for military use. With tracks for sand and mud and a boat-shaped hull for water, it carried troops from ship to shore during assaults across the Pacific. Soldiers nicknamed it the Alligator, and while it looked odd, its ability to crawl out of the ocean and onto beaches made it indispensable. Britain developed its own unusual amphibious machines. The duplex drive tank was fitted with a canvas skirt and propellers, allowing it to float. On D-Day, these swimming tanks rolled into the surf, surprising both friend and foe. The concept seemed absurd, a heavy tank floating like a raft, but it worked well enough to give infantry crucial armoured support during landings. Not all experiments succeeded so smoothly. The United States tested the Sea Mule, a modular tugboat powered by outboard motors. Its odd boxy design made it look like little more than floating platforms, yet it proved useful in moving supplies quickly. Other prototypes, such as giant amphibious trucks with oversized wheels, struggled with reliability but reflected the creativity of the time. Japan also invested in amphibious designs. Their Type II Kami amphibious tank was fitted with detachable pontoons that allowed it to float, then shed them once ashore to fight like a normal vehicle. Though never produced in large numbers, It demonstrated how seriously Japan considered the problem of crossing water to reach distant islands. The Soviets, fighting across rivers and marshes, built amphibious armoured cars that could ford streams and swamps. These vehicles looked unusual, with boat-like bodies and wheels suited for mud, but they helped keep forces moving where bridges had been destroyed. What unites all these machines is their strange appearance. To civilians, tanks with canvas skirts or tracked boats crawling onto beaches must have looked almost comical. Yet behind their odd shapes was a practical truth. War demanded movement across every environment. Land, sea and river all became one continuous battlefield. Amphibious technology was unusual, sometimes awkward, but it solved one of the war's most difficult challenges. Many of these inventions disappeared when peace returned, but some inspired modern vehicles still in use today, proving that even the strangest wartime ideas could leave a lasting mark. Some of the most unusual wartime technologies came not from machines of battle, but from attempts to control the natural environment. Weather and terrain were obstacles as dangerous as enemy guns, and engineers tried creative ways to overcome them. In Britain, scientists experimented with creating artificial fog to shield airfields and harbours from German bombers. Machines burned chemicals to release dense clouds, blanketing entire areas in mist. Pilots returning from missions sometimes had to land guided only by instruments through this artificial haze. It was risky, but it saved vital bases from destruction. Germany, meanwhile, pushed into strange areas of environmental control. One project tested the use of silver iodide to seed clouds, hoping to trigger rain that would bog down enemy troop movements. Though these early attempts at weather manipulation were crude, they foreshadowed research that would resurface decades later during the Cold War. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets relied on simpler but still unusual methods. In the harsh winters, engineers built portable heaters and frost-resistant lubricants to keep tanks and artillery moving. Entire train cars were converted into mobile snowplows to clear supply routes. While not as spectacular as rockets or jets, these small technologies meant the difference between mobility and paralysis in brutal conditions. In the Pacific, the United States struggled with jungles and heavy rains. Soldiers faced diseases carried by insects, so American scientists developed widespread mosquito control programs, spraying insecticides across islands. Combined with medical advances like quinine substitutes, these efforts turned science against the natural world itself. Japan, defending its islands, also turned to environmental tricks. They built elaborate tunnel systems and camouflaged caves, effectively reshaping the landscape to hide troops and weapons. These hidden fortresses turned hillsides into strongholds, blending nature and technology in unusual ways. Another curious American project was Fog Investigation and Dispersal Operation, or FIDO. Designed for use in Britain, this system pumped burning fuel through pipes along runways, producing heat that lifted fog and cleared landing zones. At night, glowing lines of flame lit up the edges of airstrips, guiding bombers safely home. The sight must have been eerie, runways bordered with walls of fire welcoming planes out of darkness. These environmental technologies show that war was not only about confronting the enemy directly, it was also about mastering the elements: fog, snow, rain, jungle, and disease. The solutions were often strange, sometimes dangerous, but they reveal how far imagination could stretch when survival depended not just on weapons, but on shaping the very world in which battles were fought. Not all strange wartime inventions were designed for destruction. Many were created to protect, to hide, or to help soldiers endure. Camouflage reached levels of creativity that bordered on art. In Britain, entire factories and airfields were disguised with paint and netting. Roofs were painted to look like farmland, while false hedges and barns concealed equipment. Some sites even used canvas stretched over wooden frames to imitate city streets when viewed from above. To enemy pilots, these illusions were convincing enough to waste bombs on empty ground. Germany advanced camouflage in a different way, through uniforms. the Waffen-SS introduced patterned camouflage clothing, using mottled colours and shapes inspired by nature. Though strange-looking compared to traditional military dress, these designs reduced visibility in forests and fields. After the war, similar patterns became standard for armies worldwide, showing how a wartime oddity grew into everyday military practice. In the Soviet Union, concealment often relied on scale. Engineers built dummy bridges across rivers, complete with fake supports and decking, to mislead German artillery. At night, entire convoys crossed real bridges under cover of these illusions. Soldiers also painted tanks white for winter, blending into snow-covered plains. These methods were simple, yet they represent unusual wartime innovations. Technology not in machines, but in perception. The United States developed more advanced camouflage for aircraft. Special paints reduced glare, while experimental coatings absorbed radar signals. Though early and imperfect, these efforts were precursors to modern stealth technology. One curious American invention was reflective panels used on ships. These panels, arranged in patterns, made vessels appear smaller or even invisible at certain distances. It was a strange attempt to trick the human eye with science. Japan, operating in dense jungles, excelled at camouflage by reshaping nature itself. Palm leaves, bamboo, and entire trees were used to cover bunkers, artillery, and supply depots. Some airstrips were hidden under woven mats of grass, rolled back only when planes needed to take off. The blending of natural and artificial elements turned islands into living fortresses. Another curious development was dazzle paint on ships. Though first used in World War I, it returned in World War II with updated designs. Ships were painted in bold, jagged patterns of black, white, and grey. The goal was not invisibility, but confusion. Submarine crews found it harder to judge a ship's speed and direction. The strange, almost artistic appearance of these warships was one of the most unusual sights of the conflict. These camouflage technologies remind us that war was not only about firepower, it was also about illusion, misdirection, and the art of vanishing in plain sight. Some of the most unusual wartime technologies came in the form of massive experimental weapons that seemed closer to fantasy than reality. Germany, especially in the final years, poured resources into giant construction projects that were as impractical as they were ambitious. The V3 cannon, sometimes called the London gun, was one such invention. Built in tunnels in France, it used multiple explosive charges along its barrel to accelerate shells to extreme speeds. The weapon was intended to bombard London from over 100 miles away. Though parts of it were tested, Allied bombing raids prevented it from ever becoming operational. Still, the idea of a cannon stretching through the earth, firing shells across countries, captures the strangeness of wartime invention. Another German concept was the sun gun, a space-based mirror that would focus sunlight onto enemy cities. It never advanced beyond sketches, but it shows how imagination, unchecked by practicality, shaped some of the strangest projects. The United States, though less drawn to massive guns, had its own unusual experiments. One of the strangest was the Little David, an enormous mortar built to test bombs rather than to fight battles. It fired shells as tall as a person, but its sheer size made it too slow and clumsy for real combat. At the same time, the Americans tested super-heavy tanks like the T-28, built with thick armour to breach fortifications. While impressive, it weighed nearly 100 tons and could barely move on normal roads. Britain explored similar concepts with the Tortoise, a massive assault vehicle designed to smash through defences. It was slow, ungainly, and produced in tiny numbers, but it reveals how nations were drawn toward giant, strange machines in hopes of gaining a breakthrough. The Soviets, too, dreamed of super-heavy tanks, though few reached more than prototypes. Instead, they put effort into railway artillery, huge guns mounted on train cars. These weapons could be moved across their vast territory, striking from unexpected locations. Though vulnerable to air attack, Their presence reminded everyone of the strange balance between mobility and size. Japan, with fewer resources, focused less on giants and more on unique fortifications. Still, they planned ambitious projects, including giant submarines and aircraft meant to strike the American mainland. Most were too costly or arrived too late, but the designs show how even nations under strain turn to unusual visions. These massive weapons rarely achieve success, but they symbolize the extremes of wartime imagination. When defeat or victory seemed to hang on a single invention, no idea felt too large or too strange to attempt. Not all strange wartime technologies were enormous. Some were tiny, designed for sabotage, espionage, or secret operations. The British Special Operations Executive, often called the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, developed a remarkable catalogue of odd inventions. They created exploding coal, blocks that looked identical to real coal but concealed explosives inside. When enemy trains or ships shoveled them into boilers, the result was devastating. Another curious tool was the well rod, a small bolt-action pistol built with an integral suppressor. It was designed to be almost silent at close range, giving agents a way to eliminate sentries without alerting others. These devices, though small, reveal a strange creativity aimed at stealth rather than spectacle. The Americans contributed their own unusual gadgets for covert missions. One example was the pencil bomb, a slim, time-delay explosive disguised as an ordinary pencil. It could be carried in a pocket and set to detonate hours later. Another was the development of miniature radios that fit inside suitcases, allowing agents to transmit coded messages from behind enemy lines. These tools seem almost cinematic, but they were very real, and many were tested in Europe and the Pacific. Germany, meanwhile, advanced in spy technology, with disguised cameras hidden inside matchboxes or cigarette cases. They also produced tiny transmitters for covert communication. Even their military used deception at the individual level, issuing false documents and uniforms to infiltrators during major operations. Japan worked on unusual assassination weapons, including disguised blades and explosives meant to be carried in everyday objects. Though not as sophisticated as Allied inventions, these devices highlight the same focus on secrecy. The Soviets, facing infiltration from all sides, built their own small-scale inventions. Some were ingenious in their simplicity. False walls inside briefcases, pens that concealed tiny maps, and radios built into furniture. Soviet engineers also developed silenced firearms like the Nagant revolver with a unique gas seal system, an unusual design that made it quieter than almost any revolver of its era. Beyond weapons, strange gadgets also appeared in survival kits. Pilots carried chocolate laced with stimulants, miniature fishing kits, and compasses disguised as buttons. Some kits included silk maps that were waterproof and silent, easy to fold into tiny spaces without tearing. These small technologies rarely receive attention compared to giant tanks or rockets, but they reflect another side of wartime innovation. Here, the unusual was not about size, but about subtlety. Quiet inventions, invisible until the moment they were used, often proved just as important as the loudest weapons of war. Some of the most unusual technologies of World War II emerged from the world of espionage, where creativity often mattered more than firepower. The British, masters of disguise, developed a wide range of tools that sound almost unbelievable today. One invention was the hollow coin, which could hide microfilm or tiny notes. To anyone else, it looked like ordinary pocket change. Another was the escape map printed on silk, which could be folded silently, hidden in clothing, and survive water or fire. Pilots carried these maps in case they were shot down behind enemy lines. There were also compasses disguised as buttons, belt buckles, or even pencils, all designed to help downed airmen find their way home. In the United States, the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, developed gadgets that seemed pulled from a spy novel. Exploding briefcases, cameras hidden in matchboxes, and radios built into everyday objects gave agents the ability to blend in while carrying powerful tools. One particularly strange device was the pipe pistol, a firearm concealed inside a smoking pipe. It fired only a single shot, but in close encounters, that was enough. Germany also invested heavily in spycraft technology. They produced tiny cameras disguised as cigarette packs, and even working radios built into walking sticks. Their agents carried false documents of astonishing quality, produced with printing presses hidden deep inside occupied territories. Japan's intelligence services, though smaller, developed their own unusual devices. Among them were disguised daggers hidden inside umbrellas or canes, reflecting a more traditional approach to stealth weapons. The Soviets, meanwhile, worked on their own brand of spy technology. They built suitcase radios, miniature cameras, and ingenious concealments. One famous invention was the Great Seal Bug, a passive listening device hidden inside a wooden plaque given as a gift to the American embassy in Moscow. Though discovered only after the war, it represented an unusual step in surveillance technology, requiring no power source of its own. Beyond gadgets for agents, unusual technologies were created for prisoners of war. British engineers designed Monopoly board games with hidden escape tools. Within the boards, prisoners could find silk maps, small compasses, and even real currency to use once they escaped. These strange combinations of entertainment and survival reflect how imagination entered even the darkest parts of wartime life. What makes these espionage inventions remarkable is how small and quiet they were compared to tanks or rockets. Yet their impact was enormous. In a war of nations, victory sometimes depended on the tiniest detail. A coin that opened, a map on silk, or a hidden message in an everyday object. These tools may look unusual now, but at the time, they were lifelines of survival and symbols of human ingenuity under pressure. Wartime technology also produced unusual ideas in the skies that were less about fighting and more about stretching the limits of flight itself. Germany led in this field with experimental aircraft that seemed ahead of their time. The Hortense 229, a flying wing powered by jet engines, was one of the strangest. With its sleek, triangular shape and wooden frame, it looked unlike anything else in the air. Its design reduced radar detection, leading many to see it as a predecessor to modern stealth bombers. Although only prototypes flew, its existence shows how wartime desperation fueled futuristic visions. Another German project was the America Bomber, a plan to build long-range aircraft capable of reaching the United States. Several designs were sketched, including jet-powered giants and rocket-assisted planes. None became reality, but the ambition itself reflected the strange scale of imagination at the time. In Britain, unusual aircraft designs took different forms. The de Havilland Mosquito was a fast, versatile plane built almost entirely of wood. At first, the idea seemed odd. Why build a wooden plane in an age of metal warbirds? Yet its lightweight gave it remarkable speed, and it became one of the most successful aircraft of the war. The Mosquito's unusual construction turned out to be one of the great surprises of British engineering. America also pursued strange aviation paths. The XP-55 Ascender, for example, reversed the traditional design of planes, with its tail in front and its wings swept backward. While not widely produced, it embodied the experimental spirit of the era. The Americans also tested early rocket-powered planes, blending conventional flight with new propulsion systems. Japan, limited by resources, still managed to produce curious aircraft. The Oka, essentially a rocket-powered glider, was one of the most unusual. Carried under a bomber and released near its target, it relied on human pilots on one-way missions. Although tragic, it reflected Japan's willingness to merge technology with sacrifice in ways no other nation attempted. The Soviets built unusual aircraft as well, including experimental gliders designed to carry troops silently into enemy territory. Some were massive enough to transport vehicles, pulled into the sky by bombers. Though not always successful, They reveal how far engineers were willing to go to solve the problems of moving men and machines. These unusual planes remind us that the skies of World War II were not only battlefields but also laboratories. Wooden bombers, rocket gliders, flying wings, and reverse designs all reflected the restless creativity of engineers searching for an edge. Even when they failed, they left behind strange blueprints that pointed toward the future of aviation. As the war pressed into its final years, technology reached a strange crossroads between desperation and vision. Some inventions looked almost fantastical, yet they hinted at what the future would bring. One striking example was Germany's interest in vertical takeoff aircraft. Designs such as the Focke-Wulf Triebflügel imagined interceptors that would stand upright on their tails, with rotating wings spinning around the fuselage. These bizarre machines were meant to rise straight into the air like rockets, then transform into fighters once aloft. None advanced beyond models and sketches, but the very concept foreshadowed post-war experiments with vertical lift planes and even modern VTOL jets. The Germans also pushed boundaries with rocket interceptors. The Mi-163 Comet, though dangerous to its pilots, demonstrated speeds far beyond anything else in the sky. It proved that rocket propulsion was not a fantasy, but a reality, even if the risks outweighed the rewards in wartime. In Britain, another unusual development appeared not in fighters, but in bombers. Engineers developed earthquake bombs, massive weapons like the Tall Boy and Grand Slam, designed to penetrate deep into the ground before detonating. These bombs could destroy bunkers, bridges, and even shake entire landscapes. Their size and power were unlike anything used before, a strange combination of precision and raw force. Across the Atlantic, American engineers tested experimental aircraft with odd shapes. The XP-79 flying ram was a small jet with a reinforced nose, intended to literally smash into enemy planes. Pilots were supposed to rely on the plane's armour to survive ramming attacks. Though never used in combat, it illustrates how unusual ideas were taken seriously during the rush for air superiority. The Americans also perfected long-range bombers like the B-29, which carried technologies that seemed strange at the time: remote-controlled gun turrets, pressurized cabins, and unprecedented range. These features later became standard in aviation, but in the 1940s they felt almost futuristic. Japan, short on resources, also turned to unusual designs. Wooden aircraft like the Ki-106 replaced scarce metals, while rocket-assisted weapons like the Oka blurred the line between plane and missile. They even tested autogyros, strange helicopter-like craft with unpowered rotors, to improve reconnaissance and artillery spotting. The Soviets, focusing on practicality, tested gliders large enough to carry tanks. These enormous wooden frames were towed into the air and released near battlefields. Though most were abandoned as impractical, they represented another attempt to merge air and ground in unusual ways. Taken together, these strange aircraft show the restless imagination of wartime engineers. Some projects never left the drawing board, others flew briefly, and a few reshaped aviation permanently. What unites them all is the sense that the war opened doors to possibilities that seemed unthinkable only years before. In the chaos of conflict, even the oddest ideas had a chance to take flight. Some of the strangest wartime inventions were not weapons at all but rescue technologies, designed to save soldiers and airmen from the dangers of battlefields. In Britain, one remarkable development was the Mae West life jacket. Named after the actress for the way it puffed up, this inflatable vest used small carbon dioxide canisters that, when activated, filled the chambers instantly. For airmen shot down over the channel, it often meant the difference between life and death. It may seem ordinary today, but at the time it was an unusual blend of engineering and practicality that symbolised the war's quiet innovations. Another curious British creation was the Lindholm Gear, a rescue system dropped from aircraft to assist survivors at sea. It consisted of floating containers linked by ropes, carrying food, water, and rafts. When dropped, it spread out in a line, increasing the chance that drifting survivors could grab hold. Such unusual technology shows how engineers thought not just of weapons, but of survival in desperate conditions. The Americans also developed unique rescue tools. The Gibson Girl, a bright yellow hand-cranked radio, was shaped so it could be held securely between the knees in a small raft. It allowed stranded airmen or sailors to send distress signals over long distances. Its odd shape and cheerful colour made it stand out, and it became one of the most effective lifelines of the war. Another American invention was the Jungle Survival Kit. Packed into a small container, it included concentrated food tablets, fishing gear, water purification tablets, and even tiny signal mirrors. Though not glamorous, this odd little kit represented another form of unusual technology designed to keep individuals alive far from home. Germany, too, experimented with survival technology. Luftwaffe pilots carried compact emergency radios and dye markers that stained the sea bright green to make them visible to rescuers. These ideas, though strange, reflected a growing awareness that saving trained airmen was as vital as deploying them. In the Pacific, Japan developed unusual inflatable rafts shaped like small canoes, easier to paddle through rough seas. They also issued rice-based survival rations pressed into compact blocks that lasted far longer than standard food. The Soviets, fighting across vast and remote territory, relied on survival sleds that could be pulled behind vehicles or animals, carrying the wounded back from frozen battlefields. They also experimented with insulated suits to prevent frostbite in extreme conditions. These rescue technologies may not sound as dramatic as rockets or giant tanks, but in their own quiet way, they were among the strangest and most human inventions of the war. They remind us that alongside the race to destroy, there was also a race to save, to bring soldiers home alive, even from the most impossible circumstances. While many unusual wartime inventions were practical, others bordered on the experimental and futuristic. One fascinating example was the exploration of early jet propulsion. Germany's jet fighter, the Me-262, was the first of its kind, but alongside it were plans for aircraft powered by ramjets and pulse jets that promised even higher speeds. Some designs looked more like rockets with wings than planes. These ideas were unstable in practice, yet they opened the door to the supersonic age. Britain too invested in jet technology. The Gloucester Meteor became the first operational Allied jet fighter. Its engines were temperamental, and it never faced German jets directly in combat. But its very existence showed how unusual concepts were becoming reality. Across the Atlantic, American engineers also tested futuristic designs. The Bell XP-59 Comet was the first US jet, though it struggled with reliability. Still, the fact that multiple nations were exploring jet propulsion at the same time shows how the war accelerated ideas that once seemed impossible. Japan, under immense pressure, built rocket-powered interceptors like the Shusui, modelled on German designs. Though few were completed, they reveal how unusual technology spread across continents during the conflict. Another field of experimentation was helicopters. While not yet fully practical, both Germany and the United States tested rotary wing aircraft for reconnaissance and rescue. Germany's Flettner FL-282, a tiny helicopter with open cockpits, was one of the strangest sights of the war, buzzing like a mechanical insect over the battlefield. America's Sikorsky R-4 became the first production helicopter, proving that vertical flight was more than a dream. The Soviets also explored rotary wing craft, though their resources kept most of the designs on paper. These unusual machines hinted at the future of air mobility. Unmanned technology also took its first steps in these years. The United States tested radio-controlled bombers packed with explosives, essentially early drones. Though unreliable, they foreshadowed the remote systems that would one day reshape warfare. Germany's V-1 flying bomb was another form of unmanned aircraft, a crude cruise missile that buzzed ominously across the skies of Europe. Its strangeness lay not only in its appearance, but in the new concept it introduced: machines fighting wars without pilots. These experimental aircraft remind us how quickly ideas moved from imagination to reality. From helicopters hovering above forests to drones flying without crews, the war brought strange shapes into the sky. Many failed, some barely worked. But all of them showed that even in chaos, humanity was peering into the future of flight. Some of the most unusual wartime inventions lived not on the battlefield itself, but in the hidden realm of research laboratories. One striking example was radar countermeasures. Once Britain perfected radar, Germany sought ways to blind it. They tested devices that emitted false signals and even developed radar-absorbing materials for aircraft. One curious experiment involved covering submarine periscopes with a special coating to reduce reflections. Though imperfect, these were the earliest steps towards stealth. The Allies responded with their own strange tricks. The British invented window, later called chaff, thin strips of aluminum dropped from planes that created clouds of false echoes. Radar screens lit up with phantom fleets, confusing enemy gunners. It was a simple idea with a strangely powerful effect, and it became one of the most unusual yet effective technologies of the war. The Americans advanced another invisible tool, the proximity fuse. Packed into artillery shells, it used tiny radio waves to detect when a target was near, detonating automatically. This invention seemed almost magical to soldiers of the time. Anti-aircraft fire suddenly became deadly accurate, cutting through formations of enemy planes. Small in size but massive in impact, it remains one of the strangest and most important technologies born in the war. Germany, meanwhile, explored weapons that pushed into science fiction. The Schwere Gustav, a gun mounted on rails, fired shells as heavy as cars. At the other extreme, they designed pocket pistols the size of a hand, meant for spies and infiltrators. From the massive to the miniature, their range of ideas was vast. In Japan, another odd experiment appeared: balloon bombs carried by the jet stream to North America. They were fragile paper creations, but the idea of sending destruction across an ocean without planes or ships was astonishing. Though most caused little harm, the very concept was unsettling, reminding Americans that war could reach them in unexpected ways. The Soviets too worked on radio deception. They built entire false networks, broadcasting phantom signals to mislead German intelligence. In some cases, they transmitted fake troop movements so convincingly that enemy commanders shifted forces in the wrong direction. This invisible war of signals and echoes was one of the strangest layers of the conflict. What makes these technologies so unusual is their invisibility. Unlike tanks or planes, they could not be seen or touched, yet they shaped battles just as powerfully. Radar echoes, radio waves, and unseen fuses became weapons and shields in a hidden dimension of warfare. For soldiers who lived through it, the experience must have felt uncanny, as if ghosts of machines were fighting alongside them in the shadows. As the war neared its end, strange inventions multiplied, some born of hope, others of desperation. Germany, facing collapse, turned to projects that seemed almost surreal. Among them was the idea of the vortex cannon, a weapon meant to fire compressed rings of air to knock aircraft from the sky. It never worked, but the very attempt shows how far imagination stretched. Another bizarre German concept was the wind cannon, which used explosions to create shock waves intended to damage enemy planes. Tests revealed it had little effect, yet engineers still experimented, desperate for a breakthrough. At the same time, Germany tested chemical rockets meant to intercept bombers at extreme altitudes. These strange contraptions were dangerous to their own pilots, but represented the last push toward futuristic warfare. On the Allied side, unusual projects also appeared. The Americans developed bat bombs, releasing thousands of bats carrying tiny incendiary charges. The idea was that bats would roost in wooden houses in Japan, setting off countless fires. The project was tested but cancelled once the atomic bomb emerged as the war's decisive weapon. Still, the sight of hundreds of tiny mammals carrying bombs remains one of the strangest episodes of the conflict. Britain explored odd devices for naval warfare. The Great Panjandrum was a giant rocket-propelled wheel packed with explosives intended to roll into enemy defences. During tests it wobbled wildly, veered off course, and crashed spectacularly. Though it never reached combat, its strange design made it one of the more memorable failures of wartime technology. Japan, increasingly desperate, created human-guided torpedoes known as chitin. Pilots sealed inside these miniature submarines aimed directly at enemy ships in one-way missions. Though tragic, they illustrate how unusual technology sometimes blurred into acts of sacrifice. The Soviets, less focused on fantastical projects, nevertheless tested unusual rocket artillery systems beyond the famous Katyusha. Some designs used clusters of small rockets intended to blanket vast areas. Others experimented with armoured sleds carrying explosives meant to be launched against German positions. Few saw success, but they reveal the diversity of ideas born from necessity. By 1945, the world had witnessed weapons that ranged from the enormous to the tiny, from the practical to the absurd. Some worked, some failed, and some seemed more like science fiction than tools of war. What ties them together is the sense that imagination was being pushed beyond reason, as nations searched for anything that might bring advantage in a conflict of unprecedented scale. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world looked back at a landscape of strange and unsettling inventions. Some had worked, some had failed, and many seemed too unusual to believe. Yet together they painted a picture of human imagination stretched to its limits. Germany's rockets, once tools of destruction, became the foundation for the space age. Scientists like Wernher von Braun moved to the United States, where their knowledge of the V2 helped launch satellites and eventually humans beyond Earth. What had begun as a terrifying weapon became a stepping stone to exploration. Britain's radar, born in secrecy, grew into a cornerstone of modern aviation and weather forecasting. The giant sound mirrors and strange early systems were soon outdated, but the principle of detecting invisible signals remained. What was once unusual became ordinary, shaping the world quietly. America's proximity fuses and early computers were equally transformative. Colossus and ENIAC, vast machines built to break codes and calculate trajectories, laid the groundwork for the digital revolution. At the time, they were strange contraptions of wires and glowing tubes, but in hindsight, they were the seeds of everything from smartphones to the internet. Japan's balloon bombs and rocket gliders are remembered today as oddities, yet their legacy lies in the concept of unmanned weapons. In a sense, they foreshadowed the drones of our own century, machines that fly without pilots, carrying destruction from afar. Even the Soviet Aerosani, their sleds powered by aircraft engines, symbolized how strange ideas born of necessity could survive in memory long after their practical use had passed. Beyond machines, unusual wartime technology shaped medicine, food, and daily life. Penicillin, plasma storage, nylon, instant coffee, all grew from wartime urgency. They may not carry the drama of tanks or bombers, but they changed lives far more profoundly. The quiet inventions outlasted the loud ones. The strangest truth of all is that many of these unusual technologies never disappeared. They transformed, evolved, and became the tools of peace. The war ended, but radar guided planes, helicopters lifted the wounded, jet engines carried travellers, and computers began to hum in universities and businesses. The weird inventions of World War II remind us that human creativity has two faces. In times of conflict, it races toward extremes, searching for victory. Some results are tragic, others absurd, and a few astonishing. But when the guns fall silent, what remains are the pieces that can be turned toward building rather than destroying. Looking back, we see a war filled not only with tanks, planes, and ships, but with a gallery of unusual technologies, some forgotten, some still shaping our world. And in that quiet truth lies the final irony. The strangest inventions of the war were not those that shock the battlefield, but those that quietly changed the future.